Welcome everyone and thank you for attending this presentation. My name is Jochem van der Laarschot and for the coming 12 minutes I will talk about the security practices of vendors on an online anonymous market. In this presentation I will explain how we were able to measure the prevalence of certain security practices and how we contrasted these practices between different types of vendors. But first I will give a brief introduction on online anonymous markets. Cybercrime is thriving, and online anonymous markets or darknet markets play an important role in the cybercriminal ecosystem. These markets are platforms that facilitate the pseudonymous trade of illicit physical goods and digital items. The physical goods that are transacted are mostly drugs, such as cocaine, cannabis, meth, and MDMA. On most markets, drugs are the most traded items. Next to physical items, a wide variety of digital items is transacted on these markets. Examples are credit card details, hacked PayPal accounts, money laundering services, accounts of streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify, fake identities and email addresses, and other kinds of personally identifiable information. So that's a lot of different things. On these markets, there are two types of users, buyers and sellers. Our research mainly focuses on the latter part. In the underground community, the term vendor is used for the selling party. Vendors that are active on these markets deploy security mechanisms to frustrate law enforcement investigators in their attribution efforts. Actionable information on these OPSEC techniques are frequently shared in the underground community. So given this observation, and given the increasing amount of scrutiny by law enforcement, we should expect that poor security practices are rarely present among users that are active on these markets. However, cybercriminals in general do not always achieve maximum security. This is because of the inevitable trade-off between security and efficiency of operations. Perfect security is not economically viable. Just as in the legitimate world, security in the illegitimate world comes at a cost. And this leads us to wonder how prevalent poor security practices among online anonymous market vendors actually are. To find out, we capture the security practices on a single market, the Hansa Market. Hansa became active in 2015 and was shut down by law enforcement in July 2017. About 400,000 accounts were registered, of which 1,750 are vendors. We estimate the revenue of the market to be 33 million US dollars. By the end of June 2017, the high-tech crime unit of the Dutch police infiltrated Hansa Market. They were able to migrate the Hansa Market web service and even operated the market for a while. After they shut down the market, Dutch law enforcement shared the back end with other law enforcement agencies and allowed us restricted on-premise access to the data so we could perform in-depth analyses. The backend consists of more than 100 data tables that give us insight into the complete administration of the market. Additionally, we leverage the Have I Been Pwned database, which is a famous database of leaked passwords. It consists of more than 10 billion leaked passwords, of which 600 million are unique. Next to that, we use an offline copy of the now defunct darknet market search engine Grams. And lastly, we use the Chainalysis blockchain analysis service that can provide context to Bitcoin transactions and Bitcoin addresses. It does so using certain clustering heuristics. In this way, Chainalysis is able to estimate which Bitcoin addresses belong to, for example, Bitcoin exchanges. Okay, so far I told you about the market we investigate and the data sources we use in our research. This brings me to our approach. We use a two-step approach. First, we group similar vendors together. Then, we measure the security practices of these groups of vendors. So first, about grouping similar vendors together. We cluster vendors together that are similar regarding the following characteristics. Experience, measured as the number of days a vendor is active on the market. Business success, in which I differentiate between physical items and digital items sold, and whether they are active on other markets. The latter could be quite easily observed on the Hansa market because Hansa allowed vendors to import their reputation or ratings from other markets. So from a vendor with an imported reputation, we could be sure that he or she is also active on other markets. Please note that when we are clustering vendors into vendor types, we do not consider any security characteristics. For the clustering, we use the clustering algorithm called latent profile analysis. This algorithm works like a cost optimization function, and it finds the best solution for making groups of vendors in which the groups are very different from each other, while within the groups, the vendors are very similar to each other. Secondly, we capture certain security practices in our data, and we compare the prevalence of poor practices across vendor types. I'll come back to the measurement methodology regarding the security practices listed here later. The latent profile analysis resulted in 5 vendor types. By closely inspecting their most differentiating characteristics, I named the vendor types as follows. Novices, who do not have that many physical sales experience and hardly digital sales. Then we have the drug dealers. This is a group of vendors that has more physical items sold, but still barely any digital items sold. They're active on a longer period of time than the novices. Then we have the drug lords. This is a group of vendors that has huge amounts of physical items sold. Then there are 2 clusters of vendors that specialize in selling digital items. These are the digital fraudsters and cybercrime elites. We take the following 6 practices that impact the security of vendors into account. Using the password strength estimation tool ZXCVBN, we estimate that more than half of the vendor population has a password that is considered very unguessable. That is, it takes more than 10 to the 10th, so that is 10 billion guesses to crack the password. We measure password uniqueness by matching the SHA-1 hashes of the vendor's passwords with the SHA-1 hashes of the Have I Been Pwned database. We find that 70% of the vendors uses a non-unique password. This is way more than we initially expected. Using a non-unique password is a huge risk to a vendor's security. Firstly, because the password can be guessed in a matter of minutes. And secondly, because if this vendor uses this password on both a breached ClearNet website and on the Hansa Market, then this password may lead to an email address or username of the vendor. So this password can then be used to de-anonymize the vendor. In the Hansa backend, we could see which vendors made use of 2-factor authentication enabled logins. It's good to add that 2FA on online anonymous markets works via PGP and not through SMS tags. We found that only 60% of the vendors use this extra layer of security. Moving on to the analysis of the public PGP keys we found in the Hansa backend, we extracted the key strength of the public PGP key, and we found that, well, barely any weak keys, so that's 1024 bits or less, were observed for the vendors. Even by 2015 standards, these key lengths are considered not to be sufficient. And we also found that, well, almost every vendor had a PGP key listed. Another security behavior we looked at was whether vendors use different PGP keys on different markets. Law enforcement investigators can use PGP keys to link different usernames that belong to the same real-world entity on different markets. And when these dots can be connected, by law enforcement, this forms a potential security risk. Lastly, we analyzed the Bitcoin addresses of vendors using the Chainalysis service. We found that 14% of the 190,000 Bitcoin addresses in our data could be attributed to known online financial service providers. Let's zoom in a bit on this latest statistic. What we see here is to what type of wallets vendors transact to. On the y-axis, you see the number of transactions per month. And you can also see some gaps in this plot, and that's because there's unfortunately some missing data. Having a direct link to a Bitcoin exchange forms a huge security risk. Bitcoin exchanges log information on their users, and this information can be subpoenaed by law enforcement agencies. This information may entail IP addresses, email addresses, but also full names and residential addresses. So to be honest, we did not expect any direct links to exchanges. However, as shown here, quite consistently, criminal earnings are directly transacted to exchanges. About 10% of the vendors on Hansa Market can be linked to a central Bitcoin exchange at least once. Now that I've explained how we measure the security practices in our data, and after highlighting some statistics for the whole vendor population, we will compare security practices across vendor types. First, the password strength. Here we see that the digital fraudsters use the simplest passwords, and that on average, drug dealers and drug lords use the strongest passwords. We summarize the rest of the practices in this table. If you look at password uniqueness, so whether we could match a password in the Have I Been Pwned database, you see that again, digital fraudsters behave non-securely the most often. Only 3/4 have a unique password. And again, drug lords behave the most securely. We see the same pattern for two-factor authentication usage. Less than half of the digital fraudsters use 2FA, and almost all drug lords use 2FA. Moving on to the analysis of the PGP keys. Since we found hardly any weak keys, keys are either secure, that's 2048 bits, or extremely secure, which is more than 2048 bits. In practice, till the end of 2030, there is no significant security benefit of using an extremely secure key over a normal secure key. It was therefore expected that we would not see any significant differences between vendor types. However, when we measure the preference for the extremely secure keys, we see the same trend as in the other security practices we analyzed so far. So the drug lords prefer the extremely secure keys the most often, while the digitally focused clusters behave less securely. Regarding the PGP key reuse, we found barely any differences across vendor types. Then, the last security practice we analyzed had quite a surprising outcome. Regarding the linkability to Bitcoin exchanges, we see relatively many drug lords and cybercrime elites that could be linked to Bitcoin exchanges. About a fifth of the otherwise really secure drug lords can be easily linked with an exchange. In conclusion, we found surprising patterns in security practices of users that operate on online anonymous markets. I would like to highlight two important takeaways of our research, although there are some more in our paper. First, rather counterintuitively, the clusters of vendors that specialize in selling digital items make mistakes in their digital security the most often, while the vendors belonging to the clusters of successful drug dealers tend to have the best digital security. And second, we conclude that many vendors, including the highly successful ones, make the mistake of initiating traceable cash outs to mainstream Bitcoin exchanges. Our findings shine a light on the exploitable security decisions cybercriminals make. We now know that investing in building a case against even the most seasoned cybercriminal entrepreneur is anything but impossible. Thank you so much for watching. As I only presented a selection of our findings here, I would like to invite you to read our paper. For now, I will take questions in the Q&A. And if you're watching this at a later moment and you want to contact us, please do so in using the contact info shown here.